All right, what's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here. This is chapter 25, part 1 of our lecture, okay? Okay, let me just get situated right here and we'll get going. All right, hopefully you have all your stuff in front of you and you are ready to go. Okay, so chapter 25, the 60s, 1960 to 1968. Yeah. So our first slide here. So, prior to this, we've talked about coming out of World War II, the conversation of the idea of civil rights begins kind of growing throughout the United States. Okay, so that builds throughout the 1950s. And so here we are, 1960, okay? All right, so Greensboro, North Carolina. There's a sit-in at the Woolworth's department store in their cafe, their lunch counter. So 4 students sit down to be served, and this lunch counter was reserved for Caucasian customers only. These were 4 African American students, and so they were refused service, okay? So they sat there until closing, and they returned the next day, and they did this for 5 months, okay? And so this is the beginning of the sit-in movement as we know it. So I'll talk about this a little bit more here over the next couple of slides. But so this happens for 5 months, and Woolworths eventually integrated their lunch counter, okay? Alrighty, so by the end of 1960, there were 70,000 demonstrators that had participated in sit-ins across the United States. And we have things being organized like CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality, and they organized the Freedom Rides, so we will talk about that throughout this chapter more. So I will unpack that as we go. But what they were basically, integrated groups traveled by bus into the Deep South to test the compliance of courts in the South, which were imposing segregation, okay? So hoping to ban segregation on interstate buses, trains, and terminal facilities was really the goal here. And most of this will happen in Alabama, okay? So Birmingham and Anniston, Birmingham especially, we will talk about more, but Anniston as well. Okay, and as protests escalated, so did the resistance of local authorities. All right, so we will, unfortunately, we will see that here in just a few, okay? But I have some images here. Okay, so this first one is, these are our 4 students in North Carolina in Woolworths. So this is 1960. But if we go to our next slide, this was Oklahoma City in 1958. And this was truly the beginning of the sit-in movement. It will become popularized after Greensboro, but this is the first recorded sit-in, okay? So Oklahoma City, 1958. It was led by Clara Luper, who was an educator, and they sat at the lunch counter in Katz Department Store, which was downtown Oklahoma City. I think it was on Broadway, I'm pretty sure. If it were a large department store, it would probably be on Broadway. But anyway, so that happened in 1958, and being from this area, hopefully you've heard of Clara Luper. The corridor that is Broadway Extension and 23rd Street in Oklahoma City by the Capitol is referred to as the Clara Luper corridor. So if you've ever seen that or seen her name around, that is who she is. And so she is remembered as truly sparking our sit-in movement. And if you ever go to the Oklahoma History Center, which is where I also do education stuff, there is a recreation of her living room, and then they have some artifacts related to her. But anyway, so that is Clara Luper. Okay, so let us move forward. All right, so Birmingham. Like I said, most of this action during these few years will really be centered around Alabama, okay? So, alrighty, the high point of protest came in spring of 1963, and in 1 week in June, more than 15,000 arrests were made. I guess that's a page number I have written down. Arrests in 186. I feel like that is a typo. I apologize. More than 15 arrests in... I don't know why that number's there. Okay, sorry. Anyway, okay, but so in June, 15,000 people were arrested for protesting in Birmingham and other areas in Alabama, okay? So Dr. King led a demonstration in Birmingham. He's arrested and serves 9 months in jail, where he writes his letter from Birmingham jail. If you've ever heard that or read it, I do believe it is in our textbook. There's an excerpt from it. But so that's where this letter is written. And during this time, so like I said, he led this demonstration. He's the figurehead of this action going on there. So he makes the decision to really focus on students protesting, okay? So this is children, teenagers, to show how the systemic racism that they are fighting against is impacting children and what will be the future generation, okay? So children really become the poster children, literally, for this movement, okay? So decides to use children as our main focal point for our protests in Birmingham. So this is in May 1963, and the police force, which was under Police Chief Bull Connor, he did not care that these were children and retaliated against them violently, okay? So there was use of nightsticks, and this is not just children, this is adults also, but so police brutality using their nightsticks, high pressure water hoses, and the use of attack dogs, all right? So there are a lot of images that come out of this point in time specifically that were documented by photojournalists to show how violently these protesters were being retaliated against, and the fact that they are children and teenagers, okay? Okay, so this plays off of that. So media images of African American children being assaulted prompted a public outcry, and Caucasian business owners agreed to the desegregation of downtown stores, which is where all of, lunch counters, all sorts of businesses, but eating establishments and shopping locales. Okay, so downtown stores would be integrated, and this was encouraged. So this encouraged JFK's affiliation, and he was in support of this movement. Okay. All right, so that's going on, and of course there's going to be then retaliation. So violent segregationists continued attacks in 1963. Medgar Evers, who was the field secretary for the NAACP, was assassinated. There were church bombings in Birmingham, and so in 1963, 50 bombings, of African American homes or institutions in Birmingham occurred. Since World War II. Okay, so since 45 to 63, all right? So this is a very violent point in time and a very violent area to be in, okay? Okay, and this next picture is to show you some of these protesters and just to show you how young they are, especially this, the girl in the center who's looking directly at the camera, who has a sign that says, "Can a man love God and hate his brother?" Which is so poignant, and that's why I use this image, but also to show you all just how young they were. And you can see over here on the right side that their signs are being collected by a police officer. Oh, okay, I wasn't sure if I left this in here. All right, so this next slide, if you click the link, it is a reading of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. So that'll take you to that. Okay. All right, so this same time we have the March on Washington. So everything that's happening in Birmingham, you know, it's not central to that. It's not just happening in Alabama. This is happening nationwide. So this culminates with the organization of the March on Washington, all right, which was a call for a series of initiatives, including a civil rights bill, employment programs, okay, and it reflected how the civil rights movement, you know, at that point in time was allying with Caucasian liberals, legislators, but really gaining. There's a shift that happens at this point in time, 1963, okay? But so, gaining allies, growing in magnitude. But so, we have our March on Washington, where Dr. King delivers his I Have a Dream speech, and 250,000 individuals would attend. So, if you look at this next slide, this is here's some photographs from that, okay? So you can see the size of the crowd, people singing, Dr. King waving, but so there's that. Alrighty, this will take us into the Kennedy years. Okay, so we are still very much in the Cold War. There's, you know, a lot of focus on containing communism and, you know, we talked about this before, but 1957, Sputnik is launched, so we are getting more and more into the space race, right? Okay, so Kennedy had failed at ousting Fidel Castro in Cuba, and so Castro had come to power in 1959. Cuba had previously been dependent on the United States, so this is problematic that they are showing independence, okay? All right, 1961, Kennedy allowed the CIA to launch its invasion into the Bay of Pigs in Cuba with 1,500 troops hoping to overthrow Castro. This would fail, would become an embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, and as a result, this only strengthened ties between Cuba and the Soviet Union, okay? All right, the missile crisis. All right, so the Berlin Wall is constructed in 1961, which we had talked about coming out of World War II. There's the division of Germany into East and West, and Berlin itself represents that too. So the Berlin Wall is constructed. It will be up until 1989, so we'll talk about that more later on. Okay. So the most dangerous crisis of the Kennedy administration happened in October 1962 when American spy planes discovered, so going on with the Bay of Pigs, Soviet Union was installing missiles in Cuba that were close enough to the United States to be a threat, okay? This results in a quarantine, quote unquote, rather than declaring war. The missiles are withdrawn. And so 1963, Kennedy moved to reduce Cold War tensions. So this is all happening in Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs Cuban Missile Crisis becomes kind of the defining terms of Kennedy's presidency, okay? Okay. Oops. Okay, before I mentioned that Kennedy was, our civil rights movement was working to get Kennedy's support, okay? Early on, he was reluctant to take a stand either way in regards to civil rights, insisting that it should be a local matter, which obviously was not working. He's mostly preoccupied by foreign policy, all right? So what's going on with the Soviet Union, basically, all right? The events in Birmingham forced him to take action. Okay, so remember, that's the summer of 1963. And then November 22nd, he's assassinated. Okay, he's shot in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was then shot 2 days later by Jack Ruby. But, so that is that. You know, he was starting to get involved in this discussion, and it was very abruptly halted, okay? So LBJ is then promoted, okay? So let's talk about Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Okay. So we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, like I said, the events of 1963 was beginning to get this federal recognition. So this is carried over whenever LBJ comes into office. So we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So yeah, LBJ was more focused on domestic issues than Kennedy had been. Okay, and the Civil Rights Act banned racial discrimination in employment and places of public accommodation, which included hospitals, schools, hotels, restaurants, theaters, okay? Lunch counters, all right, public accommodation. And then, yeah, stipulations on sexual discrimination would be added. Okay, all right. Okay, so 1963, the events that happen in the summer, this is then built upon for 1964, okay? Alrighty, so the our Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not address an issue that was still a major problem in the South, which was voting, okay? So coming into 1964, that's the goal for that year, okay? Voting rights, voter registration. So Freedom Summer, again, people are riding buses into the deep South. And this time around, we're looking at Mississippi, Alabama, still looking at Alabama, don't get me wrong. But Mississippi will become equally as highlighted, okay? All right, so Freedom Summer was a voter registration drive in Mississippi. All right, met with violence, which is no surprise. The same things that we talked about from 1963, that use of brute force, police dogs, nightsticks, water hoses, okay? All of that, it's just a continuation of that, okay? So our protesters are met with violence. And then there is going back to 1960, there is a conservative resurgence, which, like I said, as this is happening, there's going to be retaliation. No matter what you're talking about, there's always going to be the other side of that, okay? The pendulum will always swing. But anyway, so there's a conservative resurgence with the Young Americans for Freedom, which begins in 1960. But anyway, okay, so let's get to the Voting Rights Act. All right, we're up to 1965. Going back to Alabama. All right, so 1965, Dr. King led a group in a march from Selma to Montgomery. And the reason they chose this area specifically is because in Selma, only 355 of 15,000 African American residents were allowed to vote. Okay, so that's why this is such a hub. And again, our protesters, our marchers are met with violence, okay? So state police are sent out. This is highly televised. So going off of 1963, those images of, you know, school children being assaulted by police, having hoses turned on them, having dogs attacking them, that, in addition to, you know, by this point, this is now being heavily televised as well. So Johnson then reacts and called for a law securing the right to vote, which gives us the Voting Rights Act, 1965. Yeah, and then our 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes, which is something that, you know, we are in the middle of an election right now. So we're hearing about voter suppression that's happening in different states, trying to vote or limit people's voting rights. And yeah, so this is a conversation we're still having today, okay? Anyway, all right. Okay, immigration reform. Okay, so the belief that racism should no longer serve as a basis of public policy spilled over into other realms. So our civil rights conversation is carrying over. And immigration reform becomes part of this, okay? So immigration reform developed a racially neutral system of criteria, particularly in regards to Asian immigrants, which we have talked about a few different times throughout the semester, okay? All right, this also eliminated quotas, except for South America or the Western Hemisphere, okay? Okay, and then these two events mark the triumph of a pluralist conception of Americanism. Okay. All right, so the Great Society was part of Johnson's plan of his administration. Yeah, so the most sweeping proposal since the New Deal, and it was a system that provided health care to the poor and elderly, and also education and urban development for poor neighborhoods, okay? Alrighty, which this will create what we know as the war on poverty. So in theory, yeah, that's great. But let's see how it went wrong, okay? Okay, war on poverty. So centerpiece of the Great Society was the crusade to eradicate poverty. Okay, so in the 1960s, the administration attracted I feel like that's a typo on my part. What a surprise. Anyway, I'm going to say compared. There we go. Okay, compared poverty to an absence or defined poverty, there we go, as an absence of skills and a lack of proper attitudes and work habits, okay? So there's that in their basic terminology. Yeah, so going back to the 1930s, the federal government and society had viewed this, what am I even trying to say here? Sorry, guys. Well, let me just read this out then. 1930s had viewed as imbalance of power and flawed institutions. I'm guessing I'm reflecting on everything that eventually came out of the New Deal there, but that's so cryptic and vague, I don't even know what I'm trying to say. Anywho, okay. Yeah, so going off of our New Deal policies is what that's talking about. Okay. But yeah, so our war on poverty concentrated on equipping the poor with skills and rebuilding their spirits and motivation. And we will have things like food stamps, Head Start, and VISTA, which is the Urban Peace Corps, being developed, okay? Okay, and then I'm gonna just move ahead a little bit. Okay, so the changing African American movement is where I'm gonna move ahead to. Okay, so mid-1960s, violent outbreaks in African American communities. Sorry, I left the term ghetto in here because they will become known as the ghetto uprisings. I don't like that I did that though. Anyway, so communities outside of the South, this drew attention to the national scope of racial injustice and inequalities in jobs, housing, and education. Okay, so like I said, this will become known as the ghetto uprisings, okay? Really comes out of Harlem. Okay, so Harlem, 1964, and then Watts, the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles in 1965, which the Watts uprising is really what this will become defined by, okay? And I think that's, okay, never mind, it will be a surprise, but in the photo project, there's an image of Watts that I do believe is in there. Okay, but so, just looking at Watts, that instance left 35 dead, 900 injured, and there was over $30 million in property damage done. Okay. There were about 50,000 protesters or rioters and 15,000 police and National Guardsmen that responded. Okay, so that's why I said that Watts will become the main example of these uprisings, okay? Okay, by the summer of 1967, urban uprisings had taken place in a number of cities, Newark, Detroit, okay, yeah, and segregation and poverty were largely blamed for this, okay? So that's why I was thinking of these images. Okay, if you go to this next slide, if you just click that, it'll take you to a Google image search, but all of these images are from the Watts uprising, so I just wanted you to see the amount of devastation that came with that, okay? Property damage, that is, okay? I don't think there's anything terribly graphic, it's just images of the city afterwards, okay? But so if you will look at that, I would like for you to see the scale, which we are discussing. Okay, and I'm actually going to stop there, but this takes us to the halfway point of this chapter, which reiterates the last slide. So the changing African American movement, all right? The Watts uprising is considered to be that catalyst of change. So that is where we will pick up next time, okay? All right, if you guys have any questions for me, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.